Hi, I'm Olivia from Classroom 42, and today we're going to do a full exam walkthrough for AQA GCSE History, Paper 2, Section A. In this video, I'm going to do an exam overview, a walkthrough of each question type, some Grade 9 example answers, and some exam questions for you to try at the end as well. So for paper 2, this paper is split up into two sections, just like your paper 1 is. Section A will focus on your thematic studies, and section B will look at your British depth studies, which we'll look at in a separate video. For section A, your topic will either be Britain, Health and the People, Britain, Power and the People, or Britain, Migrants, Migration, Empires and the People, depending on what your school has chosen. For this paper, so sections A and B combined, this is a written exam and it is 2 hours long. It is 84 marks in total and it will make up 50% of your GCSE. Okay, so let's have a look at the question types for this paper. So for paper 2 section A, you've got 4 different exam question types. You've got 3 8 markers and then you've also got a 16 marker at the end. Your first 8 marker is how useful is the source. Your second 8 marker is explain the significance of, and your third 8 marker is explain 2 similarities or differences, and that is again, 8 marks. And then finally, your fourth question is an essay question. That is an evaluation question that is worth 16 marks, and you also do get 4 marks for SPAG as well for that question. Okay, so question 1. So this is our how useful is the source question, and it's worth 8 marks. For this question, you will get a source that focuses on a topic within your unit. So the source will be something that has been published at the time of the event. So it will be, published when the event has happened. So for this question, you could structure your response as follows. So you obviously need to keep your focus on the utility of the source and keep using your own opinion about what you think. But you also do need to make sure that you include all of these points as well. So for your first paragraph, you could do on why the source is useful. Your second paragraph, you could say what are the limitations to the source. And then in your third paragraph, as a bit of a conclusion, you could just give your overall judgment of the source's utility. So within your answer, you need to include the following 4 points. So first of all, you need to make sure you include evidence. So this is information from the source that is relevant to the inquiry topic. So for example, if it's an image, it will be you describing what is going on in the image. Then we also always need to make sure we bring in our own knowledge. So we can't just rely on what's in the source. We need to also bring in our own historical knowledge to show that we know the topic. So a good way to do this is to talk about how the source is accurate or inaccurate using our own knowledge. So we could say, give the evidence of the source, and then we could say, I know this to be accurate because, and then give your own knowledge. Or in your paragraph 2, you could say, actually the source is not very accurate because I know that, my own knowledge contradicts what the source says. The next thing you need to make sure you include is about the provenance. So this is the bit of text above the source that will tell you a bit about the author. It might tell you what the source is, a little bit about the background of the author, when it was published, those kind of things. So how does the source's provenance affect its accuracy and usefulness? So good things to think about are the author's background, beliefs and experiences. So whether the author has certain political views, whether they had a particular job role that might affect how they would, their opinions would be. There's all sorts of different things that might affect the author's opinion in that sense. Then we can look at the context of when and where they are writing or publishing and the information available to them. So for example, if the source was published in the exact same year as a particular event happened, we know that it was really fresh perhaps. And we can also look at where the source was published as well. So whether the source was published in, the location of the event or whether it was a bit further away. That can also affect the author's opinions. And then finally, we can look at the purpose and intended audience of the source. So this is a really great way to look whether the source is useful or even whether it's accurate as well. So for example, if a source is, for example, a propaganda poster, we know that the purpose of the source is to sort of indoctrinate and persuade and perhaps to give a view that is not necessarily the true one. And we can also look at the intended audience, so we can see whether the source is trying to entertain, whether it's trying to inform. So that'll all give us lots of information, and we'll be able to weigh up whether the source is accurate and whether it's useful as well. And then finally, we can talk about the usefulness. So we need to make a clear overall judgment of the usefulness of the source for the inquiry. So it's a really important thing to make sure that you don't confuse accuracy with usefulness. So a source might be completely inaccurate. So for example, a propaganda poster might sort of depict an event in the complete opposite way to we know that it happened. So we know that it's not truthful. However, that doesn't mean that the source is not useful. So often most sources will be useful for historians, even if they're not accurate, because for example, a propaganda poster will still tell a historian perhaps what the government were trying to portray at the time, perhaps what citizens were being told at the time, and how that might affect their opinions and their attitudes towards an event. So often sources will still be useful even if they are not accurate. Okay, so let's have a look at an example question and answer for this. Oops. Here we are. So in this video, I'll just be focusing on the Britain Health and the People topic, but all of the exam technique will sort of cross over with whichever topic you are studying. Okay, so for question 1, we've got, how useful is source A to a historian studying attitudes towards the development of the vaccine? So we can see here that is our topic, attitudes towards the development of the vaccine, and that's 8 marks. Here is our source, so feel free to pause the video if you want to have a bit of a closer look, but I'll just give you a bit of a run through about what the source is. So it is a cartoon by an English caricaturist, James Gilray, who is famous for his political and social satires. It was published in 1802, and at the bottom it reads the cowpox, or the wonderful effects of the new inoculation. And if you can see here, it shows people getting the inoculation and sort of growing cows out of their noses and their mouths and things like that. So it's quite a satirical sort of cartoon. Okay, so let's have a look at our answer for this question. So you can see here we've got our 3 paragraphs. Now usually your first paragraph will be a lot larger than your other 2, because this you'll probably include the actual evidence from the source, and you might include a bit more own knowledge within this paragraph, so that's absolutely fine. But as long as we're making sure we hit those 3 points, so we're hitting why the source is useful, we're hitting why it's not useful, perhaps not so useful, and giving a conclusion. So first of all, in my very first sentence, I say whether or not it is useful, and I'd say yes, it is useful. So for any evaluation sort of question, I would always recommend having an opinion, so saying that yes, it's useful or no, it's not. I think sometimes it can be a little bit confusing for an examiner when they're reading your work if you're sort of sitting on the fence and you're saying, oh, it's a little bit useful, but it's also not useful, and it's sort of in the middle. It's definitely a lot easier for the examiner to know that you've got your judgment and it's sustained throughout your answer if you give a sort of definitive yes or no to the question. Then we want to bring in our evidence. So this is evidence from the source. So here I am just describing what is going on in the source. So I'm saying that it exaggerates fears about the cowpox vaccine, would cause people to develop cow-like features. We've talked about the exaggerated depictions of patients sprouting cow parts, demonstrating irrational fears and widespread misinformation about the effects of the new medical procedure, showing public anxiety and influence of anti-vaccine sentiments. Then we want to bring in our own knowledge. So here you can see I've just brought in my own knowledge about Jenner and how he kind of developed the smallpox vaccination, about James Phipps, showing that when he did not become ill, it showed that exposure to cowpox would protect against smallpox. And then I've also said, however, many people were suspicious or fearful of the vaccine, especially due to its material derived from cows, which led to bizarre and exaggerated claims about possible side effects of the fears that are mocked in the cartoon. So I'm showing how the cartoon does kind of portray what actually happened. I know that people were fearful about the vaccine, so showing that the source is actually showing the truth. Okay, and then we want to talk about the provenance. So here we can say we have spoken about the provenance of the source, adding to its usefulness. Created by James Gilray, who was prominent in politics and society, published in 1802, just a few years after Jenner's breakthrough. Its timing makes it a valuable reflection for the immediate public responses to the vaccination. So you can see there we've sort of linked it and saying how, because it was so soon after the Jenner's breakthrough, it means that it gives, a really immediate reaction into the attitudes of the development of the vaccine. So always keeping it on topic to the question as well. Then we are talking about how perhaps the source might be limited. So here we're talking about the provenance again. So we're talking about Gilray's intent. So his intent was to mock and to entertain, not to provide an objective account of public opinion or scientific developments. As a result, while it is a valuable source for understanding the resistance and misconceptions about vaccination, it does not provide a balanced view of attitudes, especially those within the medical community who supported Jenner's work. So that's again a really easy way to sort of talk about a source's limitations, is to mention that it doesn't show both sides of the argument. So you can always say, however, I know that certain people agreed with this event. So, for example, some attitudes towards the development of the vaccine were positive, so it doesn't show the full picture. So that's always kind of a great way to talk about a source's limitations. And then finally, in the conclusion, we are again sort of focusing on utility. So in conclusion, while the source is not a reliable source for scientific facts, it is highly useful for a historian studying attitudes towards vaccination. So we can see here that we've said perhaps it's not obviously showing the whole truth, it's not 100% accurate, it is still useful for a historian, as it effectively reveals the negative and exaggerated reactions of the public during the early 1800s and serves as a snapshot of early resistance to medical innovation. And that is our 8 marker. Okay, so for question 2, so this is another 8 marker, but this time we are having to explain the significance. So this question will ask you to explain the significance of X in relation to Y. So for this question, it'll usually ask you to kind of explain the significance of perhaps the work of somebody or particular event or law in relation to, for example, the sort of the development of medicine, or things like that are sort of a bit more broader within your topic. So for this question, you could write 2 Peel paragraphs. So when you're writing this question, you really need to make sure that you're thinking about what significance means. So here we have got a few bullet points here. So significance means how important something is over time. So thinking about what impact did it have in the short term, what impact did it have in the long term, and was it more or less important for different people? So those are great things to sort of include in your answer. So in your 2 Peel paragraphs, first of all, you need to identify a feature of the topic that made it significant. I think a brilliant way to sort of structure this question is to focus your first paragraph on how it was significant in the short term, and then on your second paragraph talk about why it was significant in the long term, because that means you've got sort of 2 distinct different ways it was significant, and you're also hitting the short term and the long term significance as well. Then you want to give your evidence, so providing relevant, precise historical evidence. Then you're going to use your evidence to explain why this feature made the topic significant. And then final sentence will be linking back to the question. So therefore X was significant for Y because, just rounding it up and making sure the examiner knows you're sticking to the question. So let's have a look at an example question for this one. So we've got explain the significance of the work of Pasteur in the development of medicine. So we can see we've got our X, which is the work of Pasteur, and we've got our Y, which is the development of medicine. So we've got our 2 Peel paragraphs here, and I'll look into them a bit further. So first of all, we are stating our point. So firstly, Pasteur's work was significant because his germ theory fundamentally changed how people understood the cause of disease, directly influencing medical practices in the short term. So you can see here we're talking about the short-term effects. Then we're going to give our evidence. So here we have said, before Pasteur published his theory in 1861, most doctors believed in the miasma theory, which claimed that diseases was caused by bad air. Pasteur's experiments, especially the swan neck flask experiment, proved that microorganisms in the air could contaminate sterile liquids. Then we're going to explain why this was significant. So this directly challenged the miasma theory, showing that microorganisms, not bad air, cause disease. This discovery led to a major shift in medical practices, encouraging better hygiene in hospitals and influencing surgeons like Joseph Lister to use antiseptics, so showing why it was significant in the short term. And then we're just linking it back to the question and rounding up our paragraph. Therefore, the work of Pasteur was significant in the development of medicine because infection rates after surgery dropped significantly, showing how Pasteur's theory had an immediate impact on reducing disease and saving lives. Then we're going to give our second point. So in the long term, Pasteur's work was also important because it helped the development of modern vaccines. So that is our kind of long-term point. Then we're going to be our evidence. So he showed that weakened forms of disease could be used to create immunity, talking about the rabies vaccine and how it was significant in changing the focus of medicine from treating disease to preventing it. And then we're saying how his work proved that weakened microbes could be used to protect people from deadly illnesses, which became the basis for future vaccines. Then we're going to explain why this was significant. So this had a lasting impact on global health. For example, vaccines have since eradicated smallpox, controlled polio, and most recently reduced the spread of COVID-19. So we're showing how in the really long term that Pasteur's work has still had a big impact on medicine. And then we're finally linking back to the question. So therefore, this demonstrates the significance of Pasteur's work in medicine as it had a lasting global impact on public health. And that is our question 2. Okay, so for question 3, our last 8 marker for this section, here we need to explain 2 similarities or differences depending on what the question is asking us. So this question will ask us to identify 2 similarities or differences regarding a particular topic between 2 distinct time periods. So it will specifically kind of give you 2 different time periods that you have to compare. So for this question, I would recommend doing 2 Peel paragraphs. But these are slightly different to our normal Peel paragraphs. As you can see, instead of our normal, we've got point, explaining X, explaining Y, and then link. So, and then X is our first time period and Y is our second time period. So first of all, we need to state our point, so a way in which X is similar or different to Y is. Then we want to explain X, so we're going to explain our first time period that has been stated. So we're going to identify the relevant feature or characteristic and explain it using precise historical evidence. Then we're going to do the same for Y. So for example, for Y, this was similar or different because, and doing the exact same with identifying the relevant feature and explaining using historical evidence. And then finally, we can do a quick link back to the question, just summarising our point. So let's have a look at an example question for this one. So we've got explain 2 ways in which public health in the 19th century and public health in the 20th century were similar. So we can see here straight away we've got our 2 time periods. So we've got the 19th century and the 20th century. We know our topic, that is public health, and we're looking at similarities. So it's good to make sure you sort of underline those and make sure you know. Make sure you read the question. Don't just start talking about differences when it's a similarity question. Make sure you properly read it through. Okay, and then we've got our 2 Peel paragraphs here. So firstly, we go straight in with our first point. So one way in which public health in the 19th and 20th centuries was similar through increased government intervention. Then we need to explain the increased government intervention for the 19th century. So in the early 19th century, the government had a laissez-faire attitude. However, growing pressure from reformers led to the Public Health Acts of 1848 and 1875. These introduced measures such as improved sewerage systems, drainage, and access to clean water. Then we're going to do the same, but for our second time period, so the 20th century. So similarly, in the 20th century, the government continued to take greater responsibility for public health, and then we're just talking about the NHS. And then finally, we are just linking back to the question. So in both periods, the government moved away from a hands-off approach and took direct action to improve public health. And that is our first paragraph. So yeah, it's always a really good way to link it all back together by just linking back to the question, just saying in both periods, this was different or this was similar. Then finally, we just do the exact same thing for a second way that they were similar. So a second similarity is that in both centuries, public health reform was driven by influential reports that highlighted the impact of poverty and poor living conditions. And then we need to explain that topic within our first time period. So in the 19th century, Edwin Chadwick published his report, and we're talking about how that led to the 1848 Public Health Act. Then we're doing the same for the 20th century, so we're talking about the Beveridge Report in 1942, which ended up leading to the NHS. And then finally, we're just linking back to the question, so in both cases, these reports raised awareness and directly influenced major government policies aimed at improving public health. So yeah, that is how you do question 3. Okay, so for our final question, question 4, this is our essay questions. This is a 16 marker and it is also 4 spag marks as well. So it's really important that you make sure that you read through your answer once you've finished and check for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So for this question, you will always be given a statement and then you'll be asked to evaluate it. So usually the statement will say, has a particular factor been the main factor or reason in, and then whatever topic the question is focusing on. Then you also need to explain your answer with reference to the stated factor and other factors. And you also need to use a range of examples across your study of your topic from medieval period right up until present day. So for this question, there's loads of different sort of factors that the question could be asking you about. Often common ones are war, religion, role of individual, science and technology, government, those sorts of things. So you'll be given a factor like that within your question, but then you also need to bring in 2 factors of your own as well. For this question, you also must talk about at least 2 different periods of time in your answer. So this will be medieval, Renaissance, 19th century and 20th century. So you've got to make sure, 20th century up till present day. So you've got to make sure that you talk at least about 2 of those time periods to make sure you get your full marks. So for this question, I would suggest writing 3 Peel paragraphs and also a conclusion at the end as well to make sure that your judgment is really, really nice and clear. So first of all, you need to give your point. So this might either be the stated factor in the question or a factor of your own. You also need to make sure that you give your opinion on the importance of the factor. So it's really good practice just to, say right then there, this is important, or this, historians might think this is important, or, I think every factor probably is important, but you've got to obviously judge how important it is and what is the most important factor. Then you need to bring in your evidence. So this is, again, your relevant, precise historical evidence, as always. Then we're going to explain, using our evidence, you've got to explain why this factor is or isn't the main factor or reason in the topic stated in the question. And then you've got to link back to the question. So always linking back to the question, and this is a really good sort of way to add in sort of a mini judgment for each paragraph. So for example, if you have your first paragraph on the factor that you think is the most important, and then your second paragraph and third paragraphs are on factors that, are still sort of contributed, but you don't think they're the main factors. And with your link back to the question at the end of those 2 paragraphs, you could say, however, I still think that, technology or whatever the stated factor is, or the factor that you agree with, is still the main reason for this, because without technology, the effects of the individuals wouldn't have been quite so significant, for example. So it's a good way to sort of keep bringing back your own judgment, because it's always sort of something that examiners look for is a sustained judgment throughout. So they want to see that you're sort of keeping your judgment throughout your whole answer, you're not changing your mind, and examiners need to know sort of like exactly what your judgment is. You want to sort of make it really, really obvious what you think and what your judgment is, so then when they come to your conclusion, they're not surprised. They know exactly what you're going to say. And then, that comes us on to our conclusion right at the end after our 3 paragraphs. You just need to briefly explain and sum up which factor you think is the most important and why. So let's have a look at an example question for this one. So we've got, have technological advancements had the biggest impact on the improvement of public health in Britain? Explain your answer using reference to technology and other factors. Use a range of examples from across your study of health and the people, circa 1000 to present day. So here we can see immediately what our factor is, so it's technology, and our sort of topic is improvements of public health. So for this question, I wouldn't really recommend writing an introduction. You don't really need one, so you can kind of just go straight into your first paragraph. So you can see here we've got our 3 paragraphs. So we've got 1 on technology, 1 on the role of individuals, and 1 on government. And then we've just got our short conclusion at the end to sum it all up. So first of all, as always, we are stating our point. So technological advancements. Then we need to bring in our evidence. So here I am talking about the sewage system created by Joseph Bazalgette in the 19th century, how this came in response to repeated cholera outbreaks and the Great Stink, and how the system carried waste out of the city, preventing it from contaminating the water supply. Then we're going to explain how this improved public health in Britain, so always linking back to the question. So this was a significant technological solution to a widespread health problem that showed how engineering could prevent disease on a large scale. Then we're going to link it back to the question. Therefore, technological advancements had the biggest impact on improvement of public health because without this infrastructure, thousands more would have continued to die from preventable waterborne diseases. So the impact was both immediate and long-lasting. So we're explaining kind of why we think that technological advancements was the biggest impact, and we have stated that yes, we think that had the biggest impact. So then we can bring in our second factor. So here we're bringing in individuals. So however, individuals have also played a major role in improving public health. Here we're talking about Edwin Chadwick, who published his 1842 report on living conditions, which helped persuade the government to pass the Public Health Act, which started a new era of public health reform. We're going to explain why this was significant. So Chadwick's efforts helped to change the public attitudes and encourage the idea that improving hygiene and living standards could reduce disease. It also marked a shift from laissez-faire attitudes to a more active role. However, we have already said that we think technology is the biggest factor, so we've got to sort of reiterate that throughout our answer. So we're linking back to the question here. However, while Chadwick raised awareness, the changes he inspired could only be fully implemented once technological solutions were available to carry out the reforms. Therefore, although individuals helped to inspire action, it was technology that delivered the lasting improvements. So just reiterating the fact that, however, although individuals played a role, we still think technology was the most important factor. And then we've just got to do that again, but with a different factor. So this time we're talking about the government also had a vital role in improving public health. So you can see here, our first two paragraphs were linked to the 19th century, but here we're talking about the 20th century, so we made sure that we've hit having at least two different time periods. So for this one, we are giving our evidence about the Beveridge report and about the NHS providing citizens with free access to healthcare, which led to improvements in life expectancy and access to medical care. So that's how government action helped to improve public health. We're going to explain this. So this had a huge impact on people's health by allowing early treatment and reducing inequality. Also about the beginning for a more organised state-funded healthcare system. Then again, we are just linking back to the question, linking back to technology, which we think is the most important factor. However, the effectiveness of the NHS depended on medical advances such as antibiotics to treat infections, x-rays for diagnosis, and later vaccinations to prevent diseases. Therefore, although government decisions were important, their successes often depended on the availability of advanced medical technology. So once again, we're saying, although this is an important factor, without technology, it wouldn't have been able to sort of make as much progress. And then finally, we're just linking back to the question and summing everything up in our conclusion. So we're just concluding that while individuals and government intervention had a big influence on public health, technological advancements had the biggest impact overall. This is because without tools created by technology, individuals would not have been able to push for practical improvements and government reforms would have had limited impact. So again, that conclusion is by no means surprising to the examiner. They know exactly what our judgment is. We're just reiterating it for them so they know we've definitely got a sustained judgment throughout our answer. And that is a 16 marker. Okay, so now it is your turn to have a go at putting that exam technique into use. So I will put some of our 16 mark questions from paper 2A below for you to have a go at, and that will be across all of the thematic studies topics. And for these questions, you'll be able to get instant AI marks and feedback so you can see exactly where you were going right and wrong. But yeah, that is the end of this video. Good luck with your revision, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!